So Brian, could you just tell us generally what exactly is ISIS and what have they been doing in Iraq and Syria?
Thanks, Kerstyn. And I apologize, my voice is a little scratchy. ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Sham, or ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, or IS, the Islamic State. There's a whole debate over the naming. Controls a large swath of territory in Iraq and Syria. It's basically the latest iteration of a Salafist, Islamist extremist organization. It's had a bit of a power struggle with Al-Qaeda. It seems to have come out on top. I'll refer to the organization as ISIS. Has some of the features of a nation state. They think of themselves as, they declare themselves to be a new caliphate, control territory, they have a language, they've got an economy, they're selling oil illegally, they're running racketeering. So in some ways it's like, Tony Soprano took over your, part of New Jersey, ran it as the emir. They've got that. They're attracting jihadi talent internationally. So their support base comes from Chechens, it comes from disaffected Muslims in Europe, the United States. They're recruiting in India and Pakistan and in Southwest Asia. So they're basically becoming the main franchise for the Islamic extremist caliphate cause. They've been extraordinarily brutal. Everyone's seen the beheadings, the crucifixions. What's particularly disturbing is the use of rape as a means of genocide, which we thought we'd gotten rid of in Bosnia. Unfortunately, it's back in a big way. It's incredibly cruel and brutal, but in some ways that has even attracted more of the jihadis to their cause. So it's a dangerous opponent, and it's going to be interesting to see how it's confronted, not just by the U.S. but also by its neighbors in the coming months and years.
Thank you for that quick overview. This next question I think I'll throw to our student panelists to begin. As we all know, there are many players in this region. Nothing happens in a vacuum. So I guess we'll start with Shikhar. What broader implications does the actions that we've started have on the region as a whole?
Some of the implications that stem from our intervention with ISIS or just ISIS's presence in the region. One of it deals with Al-Qaeda to begin with. ISIS and Al-Qaeda are not aligned together, and Al-Qaeda is actually, I guess, not at war with ISIS, but kind of they have a tension going on there. And a lot of, and with ISIS's declaration of a new caliphate, Al-Qaeda is struggling to maintain control over its historic region within Afghanistan and Pakistan, where we see a lot of locals putting on ISIS flags over certain areas of territory, particularly in Peshawar. And that's leading to Al-Qaeda to declare a new branch within South Asia. It's leading to Al-Qaeda trying to be a little more belligerent in their sort of rhetoric and their sort of expansion. So it's showing this sort of interesting dichotomy between the two, and Al-Qaeda trying to get more control back after ISIS has done all this during the past couple of years.
Great. Raymond, would you like to respond?
Yeah, sure. I think there's also implications here on the countries involved in the Arab League, so those that have provided support over the past few weeks, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Jordan, the UAE, and Qatar. Some of these states, especially Saudi Arabia, they have a lot to lose. Other states like Qatar, they're trying to remain on our good side just in case for future implications too. And looking at the international relations of the zero-sum game too, also to consider if ISIS is defeated, how they're defeated, what implications that have for the Assad regime, which we've obviously had tensions with over the past few years. So I think there's some other implications to look at as well.
Our adult panelists would like to jump in.
More than one.
Our other what panelists?
We're grown-up panelists. We're all adults here.
I think so. I think Yasmeen just called me a senior citizen. And, I mean, I'll be honest with you, Yasmeen. I think Ray and Shikhar and Robert did an excellent job in providing an overview of the situation as it exists on the ground in the Middle East. I come at this, from somebody whose background is in domestic American politics from a slightly different perspective. And what's been most interesting to me is watching President Obama in this. And in fact, he talked to the United Nations today. He's spoken to the nation about this. And he came under a lot of criticism, particularly early on, for what a lot of people thought was a hesitation on his part to involve the U.S. militarily again. And I come at this not necessarily to speak on his behalf or against him, but to me it's been fascinating watching the president on this, because if you think about it, the greater part of his political identity for more than a decade now has been as a very strong opponent of U.S. military engagement where he thinks it is inappropriate. His first campaign for the United States Senate, certainly in his campaign for president in the primary, he ran against Hillary Clinton, against Joe Biden, against any number of other people who had originally supported the war in Iraq. And I'd argue to you that what keyed Obama's primary victory and possibly his general election victory as well in 2008 was that he had been the only major political figure on that landscape, excuse me, to oppose the war from the beginning. He, for years now, has been the guy who's going to end the wars. And all of a sudden now, whether you think what he's doing now is the right thing or not, he's not that guy anymore. And presidents, at least in that respect, aren't that different from the rest of us. Once you build up a certain identity of yourself, it becomes pretty central to who you are and how you think of yourself. And if for some reason, when you come to college, when you graduate from college, at a certain point along the way, when you realize that your identity is not what it has been for many years, that's a very, very difficult adjustment to make. And again, regardless of whether you happen to agree or disagree with the course that the president is charting right now, it's understandable why he may have seemed somewhat hesitant and somewhat reluctant early on, because completely aside from the military and geopolitical challenges that my three colleagues have pointed out, that's a difficult thing for any person to do. And realizing right now, and the president himself has said this isn't going to be over when he leaves office. This is going to be one of his successor's greatest challenges, and perhaps his successor's successor. And now he knows that regardless of how well or poorly this turns out, he's not going to be remembered as the U.S. president who ended our U.S. military engagement in the Middle East. That's got to be a difficult thing to come to terms with, and persevering anyway is something I think he deserves credit for.
Thank you, Mr. Schnur. My next question, I will again point to Mr. O'Brien, having to do with the very unique broad coalition that is going to be put in place to deal with this conflict. President Obama recently announced this broad coalition to fight ISIS extremists, which includes operation involving expanding airstrikes, allocating additional U.S. support and personnel in Iraq, having support for moderate Syrian rebels. What impact, if any, can we foresee this very unique coalition having?
Oh, that's a great question. It creates another one of these ironies. I was on the ground in New Hampshire and to some extent in Iowa in the 2008 presidential campaign, working for a candidate on the Republican side that did not win, but our headquarters was right next to the Hillary Clinton headquarters in Manchester, New Hampshire. And I wonder what Bill and Hillary are thinking now, given the artillery that was thrown at them by the Obama campaign, by Axelrod and Plouffe and those guys for voting to authorize the second Gulf War. That's the reason she ultimately lost her primary. I'm not an expert on the Dem side, but we'd be in the same coffee shops and that sort of thing. All the candidates coming through doing their thing, and it's got to be a little bit ironic for her and Bill. I'd love to hear what the two of them have to say over coffee in the morning, talking about the president. But that leads to a second ironic thing that's happening now. I watched the president the other night when he gave his address, the first address that we would be bombing ISIL or ISIS. And I thought back to President George W. Bush and all the addresses he gave. And when President Obama talked about putting together a coalition, and at that time there were 21 countries that were going to be supporting us. And when I was in the UN, I remember how much, how badly President Bush, George W. Bush, was hammered for his coalition of 41 countries. We had folks with boots on the ground. We had, what we thought was an impressive coalition, and yet that was this coalition of the willing, or the coalition of the bribed, and that sort of thing. And now to watch President Obama go before the American people on TV and motivate them and seek their support for another military intervention in Iraq. This will be the third one, and actually the fourth one if you consider what President Clinton did, the fourth military intervention in 4 administrations in Iraq, and try to motivate the American people to support him was ironic. And it was further ironic to hear him talk about the international coalition that would be supporting him and that he was going to mobilize and send Secretary Kerry out to do it. I remember when Secretary Powell was out doing that, when my former boss, John Bolton, and I were at the UN to work on it and get votes and keep the coalition together. This coalition is in some ways is easier to build, but it's trickier. It's probably the most unique coalition. I mean, everybody hates ISIS, well, everybody with a few exceptions. So you have a coalition of very strange political bedfellows. You have the Shia powers, Iran, and a minority Shia government, Alawite government in Syria together supporting this, if unspoken, but there's unspoken cooperation going. If you consider Iraq a Shia regime, which for the most part is, you have that axis also on one side. You have the Saudis, you have UAE, you have the Egyptians also supporting the coalition. You have Russia, at least tacitly supporting the coalition because they have a naval base in Syria. They're supporting the coalition for geopolitical reasons. They probably don't care who wins the Shia-Sunni fight, but they want to keep the naval base in the Mediterranean. It's the only naval base outside of the former Soviet Union that they can still use. Then, of course, you have America and its NATO allies who are involved. So it's a whole group of strange bedfellows. And then you've got the folks that are sitting this out a little bit. You've got Turkey, which is very ambivalent about the whole crisis because Erdogan, I don't mean to say that he's brutal or cruel or would violate human rights in the way that ISIL does, but he's an Islamist. And he's kind of in the same camp with the Muslim Brotherhood. He's supported Hamas in Gaza. He was very friendly with the Muslim Brotherhood when they were operating in Egypt before the coup. So Turkey is ambivalent about the ISIL situation. They're also still concerned about their own Kurdish population because the winners that may come out of this are the Kurds in Iraq. And we may have an independent Kurdistan, something that the Kurds have wanted for well before Sykes-Picot for a long time. And so Turkey's ambivalent, Qatar's ambivalent, certainly the Palestinian Hamas, the Palestinians in Gaza are probably ambivalent. So it's an interesting coalition that's formed to defeat ISIS. You wonder what will happen if the coalition is successful. Well, then the what I'll call the moderate Sunni powers, the monarchies, and the Shia powers be back at each other's neck. Will the U.S. and Russia be back at each other's neck? China is sitting this out because they can, but they have an interest in defeating ISIL. They've got their own concerns about extremism among the Uyghurs and in Western China. So it's a very, very interesting geopolitical situation. I've talked too long here on this question, but it's one for you to go home and think about how those pieces of that international coalition fit together.
All right, well, does anyone else want to jump on that, or we can move on? But I guess sort of similar to what Mr. O'Brien said in terms of obviously there's really interesting geopolitical strategies happening with all these different countries, but there's also a human rights aspect, and that's obviously something that hasn't been ignored from the videos of the journalists who were beheaded online to even just the minorities within the region who have been subject to really vicious attacks. So maybe we can discuss sort of like the human rights implications and how that's brought us into this.
Yeah, so I think this issue became really, really salient, the ISIS incident I'm speaking of, probably after the James Foley beheading incident. But even beforehand, I think we have to remember the aspect that really got a lot of coverage in our media and started building a lot of support was just the graphic human rights violations of the Yazidis and the Christians in Iraq and Syria. You saw folks fleeing to the mountains and just hiding and being either forced to convert or being murdered, in some situations being told to convert, but they really weren't allowed to convert and they were just murdered. You see images in Syria where bodies are being crucified, where people are being lashed for no real apparent reasons, where there's just absolute totalitarian rule. And at the same time, while even most isolationists here in America don't believe we should intervene unless we have an interest in state, it really does turn your stomach, and it really makes you wonder if you don't respond swiftly and quickly enough. If we look back just 1994 in a situation like Rwanda, where it only took a matter of weeks for 1 million people to be slaughtered, and whether we really want to see that again. So it's been interesting how fast this has been developing, especially with the human rights implications and what we've learned over the past 20 years or so.
So just as a reminder, in a few minutes we're going to turn the discussion over to all of you to query any of our panelists. So in a few minutes, if you just want to think about what some of those questions may be. I think I'll ask one of our final questions, pointed again to Mr. Schnur and Mr. O'Brien. We talked a little bit about the international coalition globally that, as you mentioned, is interesting to think about for all sorts of geopolitical reasons. But there's also an international coalition, an interesting coalition here domestically that is maybe taking some different opinions than what the party line may think that they would take against this conflict. Can we talk a little bit about how some of our politicians in Congress today are feeling about this conflict?
You know, we've gotten so used to the spectacle of the two parties lining up almost automatically on opposite sides of most issues, both domestic and international. But what's really striking about this debate is it really has blurred traditional partisan allegiances in both the Democratic and the Republican Party. The base of the Democratic Party has always been very wary, historically, of U.S. military engagement. And in this case, large numbers of Democrats, of course, are supporting the president on this. Not just because it's a Democratic president, but because they see a real threat here that requires a strong response. And for the Republicans, you're seeing a similar split. Again, for decades now, when an issue of military engagement comes up, it's almost automatic. Republicans line up in favor of military engagement, Democrats line up against it. And just as the Democrats are divided, so are the Republicans as well. And there's an increasingly strong and influential isolationist representation in the Republican Party. This is probably the first time, I would argue, since the 1940s, since the first few years after World War II, in which you saw very strong conservative Republican voices arguing not in favor of, but against military engagement. And so the bases of both parties are very suspicious of this, and in a lot of ways for very similar reasons. The center, the establishment, if you will, of both parties have lined up behind the president. I think the thing to watch going forward, though, is while the American people have voiced very strong support, according to public opinion polls, of the president's decision to engage military in the Middle East, one of the things we've seen over history is public support for war or for any type of military action starts out at its peak, and it only goes down after that. Why? Because every night we see footage, every day we see video of very bad things happening when war takes place. And so, almost inevitably, as time passes and military engagement continues, the American people become less and less supportive. And the real trick going forward, if you are a Democrat or Republican thinking about running for president in 2016, you look at those polls and you say, wow, the American people really support Obama on this. maybe actually line up with them too. But of course, as we saw in the previous Iraq war, as Robert was talking about earlier, a lot of people who lined up in support of that president back in 2003 ended up on the wrong side of public opinion by the time it was their turn to run for president. So if you're in either party, a potential candidate for president, it's a pretty tricky political decision right now. Do you stand with where the American people are today, or where you think they're going to be in 2 years? And watching the players, not just Clinton on the Democratic side, and not just Rand Paul and some of the more isolationist voices on the Republican side, but across the board, it's a really tricky line to walk. And the fact that there's bases of opposition already so strong in both parties really creates a very unique situation.
Yeah, if I can weigh in just very quickly to follow up on what Dan had said in an earlier answer. This president is a president that took great pride, and I know because we bore the brunt of it in at least one of the debates, in the fact that he had ended the war in Iraq, and that was going to be his legacy. And now we're back in Iraq, and he was on a path towards ending the war in Afghanistan, and it was unlikely, the way things were going, that we were going to end up with a status of forces agreement in Afghanistan. So the path that we were on was to remove all American troops from Afghanistan. What's happened since, because of the rise of ISIS, let me deal with Afghanistan first. Folks are looking at Afghanistan and saying we really made a mistake in Iraq in not having a status of forces agreement, in not leaving American troops on the ground. We allowed this ISIS cancer to metastasize, and the Taliban will do the same thing in Afghanistan, or ISIS will end up in Afghanistan, or Core Al-Qaeda, whatever the franchise is that takes the lead, will do the same thing in Afghanistan. And then we're going to be in a situation where, like today in Iraq, we have 2,000 soldiers in Iraq, boots on the ground. Not too many fewer than we would have had if we'd had a status of forces agreement of 4,000 or 5,000. Folks are now looking at Afghanistan and saying we cannot have a complete withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think now it's doubtful that the president will risk not having a SOFA in Afghanistan, and I don't think he'll risk pulling all American troops out of Afghanistan. So it's had an effect in Afghanistan. President Obama is not going to be able to say that he completed the war there and pulled all the American troops back. And in Iraq, he sent 2,000 American troops back, and we have, of course, the air campaign being waged by the Air Force from bases in the Gulf, and the naval aviation from the carriers, and the missile strikes from the cruisers and the destroyers. And so not only does he lose his legacy, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, he's also going to start being criticized, fairly or unfairly, for the conduct of the military campaign against ISIS, because that's what we do as Americans. I mean, Abraham Lincoln got it. George Washington was criticized. People forget this. There were folks in the Continental Congress that were upset with Washington when he was running the war. They were upset with Lincoln, the way he ran the Civil War. People were upset with Roosevelt in the Second World War. Certainly LBJ lost his presidency because of criticism of Vietnam. Both President Bushes were criticized for Iraq for different reasons, because Bush 1 didn't finish the job, because Bush 2 actually went in. President Bush rescued with the surge, but even the surge was criticized. So President Obama will now start having to field criticism, not just from the isolationists, the Republican Party, and the anti-war Democrats, that he went back to Iraq. That'll be part of the narrative. The second part of the narrative will be from folks watching the military campaign saying, you're doing too much, you're not doing enough, you're killing too many civilians, you're not being robust enough, you're only using air power, you need to put folks on the ground. You've got too many folks on the ground. So it's going to be a very, very tricky road for the White House to navigate over the next 2 years. I don't envy them, and I hope we're successful as an American. We want to see this succeed, and we want to see our troops come home safely, but it's going to be very, very tough politically for the White House.
If I can just jump in for a minute before we go to questions, I want to clarify something I said earlier about President Obama. When I talked about his early hesitation, and when I talked about the internal challenge somebody faces when they have to confront the kind of things that the president has, I didn't mean for that to come across as critical. And in fact, if the president were being advised only on domestic political considerations, then his advisors would be telling him this is not what you want to be doing, Mr. President, heading into the midterm elections. If domestic political considerations were the only considerations, they would be saying to him, Mr. President, you got to talk about the economy, you got to talk about healthcare, you got to talk about immigration. You need to push the agenda that we laid out last spring and earlier this summer. And so again, whether you're a supporter or an opponent of the president's, it's worth recognizing that this decision was made for reasons clearly having very little to do with domestic politics, which had to make it even more difficult.
Great. At this time, we're going to transition over to the question period of the talkback. As we do with all students' talkbacks, we ask that first and foremost you introduce yourself. So list your name, your major, and your year, and also address the panelist with whom you're asking the question. And as always, if you're addressing a panelist you disagree with, don't be disagreeable, and give them the same sort of courtesy and respect that you would expect them to give back to you. So with that, I think we'll open it up to questions. Does anyone want to start? Yes.
My name is Steven. I'm a political science and economics double major, currently a junior. And my question is mostly for Mr. O'Brien and Mr. Schnur. So there's already been intervention in Iraq, and I'm just wondering what could you see being the potential implications or the prerequisites for direct intervention in Syria, spreading into Syria?
Well, we're in Syria now, at least with missile strikes and airstrikes. Syria is a very tricky situation because there's a civil war going on in Syria, and the UN is probably withdrawing its troops from the Golan area, the Syrian-Israeli border, because those troops have been attacked by Islamists. It would be a very, very difficult situation to put American ground troops into that unsettled situation in Syria. So I think it's unlikely that we're going to see U.S. ground troops there. I do think that we're going to see, and the Congress has authorized further training of the Free Syrian Army and the so-called moderate Syrians. One of the problems there is, and this isn't a criticism from the Republican side, this is something that, for example, Secretary Panetta or Secretary Clinton said, is that they urged early on, as did the Joint Chiefs, General Dempsey said this in his testimony last week, that they urged training of the Free Syrian Army. That was not done early on. Much of the Free Syrian Army was decimated by the Assad regime. And just, again, it was a very interesting tack that Assad took. Assad focused his firepower on the Syrian moderates, the secularists. He allowed ISIS to grow. There's a very small, moderate, secular Syrian opposition left. And Assad has now put himself in a position with the West to say, do you want me, or do you want these crazy guys that are beheading and crucifying people and raping every woman they see? All of a sudden, ISIS started to look a lot better as this tyrant Bashar al-Assad. So he played that very well. And we're in a very difficult situation right now in Syria, where some of the folks that we would like to see governing Syria, many of them have been killed either by ISIS, which has been attacking them for not being pure enough or extreme enough in their Islamic faith, and also being attacked by, on the other front, by a Ba'athist regime and minority al-White regime that sought to wipe them out. So there are not a lot of good options right now. I think we're going to do the best we can, but I don't see American ground troops in Syria as a result of that.
Well, Robert certainly has a lot more expertise on this than I do, but just from what I've read, I'll offer you 3 thoughts, and I think it's a terrific question. Number one, at least from the other experts who I read, I think it's going to be very, very difficult for the U.S. and its allies not to put ground troops in Iraq and Syria. Iraq is one challenge, and it's a difficult one, but this has happened before. During the so-called Sunni awakening during the last Iraq War, the U.S. Military was able to work with local Sunni and regional Sunni tribal leaders to get them to rise up against al-Qaeda. And while that's a more formidable task here, it's something that's been done before. In Syria, as Robert mentions, there are roughly 5,000 Free Syrian leaders. And first of all, I'd argue that being more moderate than ISIS and more moderate than Assad is not necessarily moderate. Being the tallest jockey at the track doesn't make you all that tall. And so you got 5,000 Free Syria fighters who are going to need months and months of training. And even the president's own top military advisor, General Dempsey, makes it clear that you can't win an engagement like this with just air power. And so if that small number of untrained Syrian rebels can't be trained a lot more quickly than it sounds like is going to be possible, it's hard to see how this progresses without a greater ground presence. The second thing I'd offer is that the term military advisors is a little bit of a misleading one. When you hear that the U.S. is sending military advisors, the first thing that a rational person would think is that we're sending them an email saying, no, hold your rifle this way. No, march in line. Yeah, that's better. But our advisors, even if they're not engaged, even if they are not firing weapons themselves, are very directly engaged in combat. And one of the things we've seen in past military actions is when someone is sent overseas as an advisor, if he or she is in a combat situation and they are fired upon, it's very, very difficult not to engage much more directly. Some of the strongest voices you hear from the anti-war movement is that this type of advisor presence is sort of a slippery slope. First you tell someone to advise, then they defend themselves, then they become more proactively involved. And the challenge for the president here, like in any situation, is just because you're on a life is a slippery slope. The trick is getting off the slippery slope. I just don't know how, given the capability of the Syrian rebels, that the U.S. and its allies can get off that slope without a more robust on-the-ground presence. Again, I don't say that as a good or a bad thing, just a thing.
Do we have another question? Oh, sorry.
No worries. I was just going to add a quick point also. Just quickly. There's a problem with getting involved in Syria because Russia is already extremely comfortable with the Assad regime. And then also they have the naval base there. So getting more involved there would kind of strike some ire with Russia. And that would also possibly lead to some additional problems with getting a broader coalition in targeting ISIS.
Question, yes, sir.
My question goes out to the whole panel. My name is Luke Phillips. I'm the director of PSA. My question goes out to the whole panel. Why are we targeting ISIS? What are we trying to do? Why are we trying to destroy them? And what is the end goal in Iraq that we seek? Because to me, ISIS to me looks like a radical force, but fundamentally it's still an actor. Not some kind of cancer that's going to spread across the world and poison it all, the way U.S. foreign policy rhetoric has been over the last decade. In my opinion, I see ISIS as being someone who we would definitely be involved in large-scale combat with, but we wouldn't necessarily be in an attempt to completely destroy them, lest they be replaced by something more radical. And I think they are doing a pretty good job of keeping at least some form of order in the part of Iraq they're in. So I'm just wondering, in this world of chaos, why are we trying to destroy someone who's keeping order?
Luke, your question is for anyone on the panel?
Yes.
Would anyone like to take a first stab at that?
I can think of a couple reasons. I think the first one's the human rights aspect. I think there's been no point in human history where we've looked back and regrettably stepped into a situation where there was genocide occurring. And we do consistently look back and think about what we could have done, what could have FDR done if he let more Jews in during World War II, what could have been done in Cambodia after the Vietnam War, or in Vietnam itself, what could have been done in Rwanda, and what could have been done in Kosovo and the Balkans. And when we fail to act in some of these instances, not saying that I necessarily agree with every detail here of how this is going on, I think there are dramatic on a broader scale. A couple of the things to look. ISIS hasn't been looking just to stay confined within Syria and Iraq. They are this Islamic state. One of the reasons why Saudi Arabians and the other Arab League countries have gotten involved is the precise fear that they're trying to expand to other regions within the Middle East. And lastly, too, I think we have to consider that ISIS is unique in the sense that many of its members are Westerners. So those who executed James Foley, those were British citizens. And we had to consider the implications, too, as well on how we affect our homeland as well with our citizens. And so I know there was a big State Department, I forget what it's called.
Think Again, Turn Away.
Think Again, thank you. Again, Think Again, Turn Away. And those are some other implications as well, seeing how that affects our citizenry at home and other Western countries as well.
Building off Ray's point, ISIS has propaganda unlike any terrorist group we've seen in recent years, been like Al-Qaeda with their propaganda targeting the Westerners with the Inspire magazine. Their propaganda has gotten tons of European citizens, Australian citizens, American citizens, South Asian citizens to join the cause. They have a force of nearly, I think it's like 50,000 now. They have a pretty massive fighting force. So recruiting heavily from the West is a major security concern for the United States. Then beyond that, there's also the power politics or geopolitical standpoint. As I mentioned earlier, with ISIS expanding and ISIS posing a threat to Al-Qaeda is doing the same too and trying to regain its sort of power as the sole sort of emir of, or the sole caliphate in the region. And with ISIS continually trying to expand, you're going to see a sort of more, both these groups trying to expand more and more, particularly in Afghanistan. We'll see Al-Qaeda core and the Taliban getting a little more active. And with the United States considering withdrawal, that leaves sort of like a vacuum there. And with Al-Qaeda just recently announcing a new affiliate in South Asia, that leads another sort of concern that Al-Qaeda is trying to expand and counter the expansion of ISIS. So that poses real concerns for the United States and its interest in the region because it leads to a sort of larger expansion of this sort of terrorism in the area. Not just with ISIS, but with other groups trying to counter ISIS as well.
Thanks. Look, it's a good question, and I think at least the initial part of your question probably reflected the Obama administration's view of the situation until fairly recently. There's a reason Americans don't want to get drawn into another land war in the Middle East and in Asia. It's a tremendous drain of our treasure, but more importantly, our blood. We've had a lot of young American men and women who've sacrificed for these same cities, Fallujah, Anbar province, and Baghdad, that were, Ramadi, that were now seen taken over by ISIS. ISIS is a direct threat to the U.S. because it's a direct threat to our key allies in the region. It's a direct threat to Jordan. It's a direct threat on the border with Israel. It's certainly a threat to Iraq. If you consider Iraq an ally, it's certainly a country that we've invested a lot into with American blood and treasure. So and the last thing that we want is an extremist state taking over the Middle East that has values that are rooted in the 6th century or 7th century at best. So that's one interest. Another interest is certainly, as we pointed out, the fact that it's become a magnet for jihadists around the world. And we know what happened the last time jihadists had a safe haven in Afghanistan, when the Taliban allowed Al-Qaeda to plan the Cole bombing, NSC bombings, and ultimately 9/11. We want to deny safe haven to those that would use it to plan attacks against the American homeland, against our allies in Europe and in Australia, in Singapore and Indonesia, and in other states around the world. And then finally, as Ray pointed out, and I'm just recapping what both Ray and Shikhar both said, is there is a right to protect issue. And we can't right every wrong around the world. Right? If we did, we would have been in the Congo long ago saving people where 1 million people have died in the Civil War. But there is, when we can make a difference, and where we see the most gruesome, barbaric violations of human rights taking place, where you're seeing women tied to trees and serially raped by every ISIL soldier that comes by them and then left to die without food or water. When you see hundreds of young conscript soldiers being herded into a ditch and mowed down with machine guns, when you see people being beheaded and crucified, that is simply not a world in which most Americans want to live in. And so while we can't right every wrong, where we can make a difference and where we can stop this sort of depravity, I think we have a duty to do so, as do our allies. It shouldn't just be an American obligation to protect. Our allies need to step forward and do it, and hopefully this coalition will coalesce in a way that we don't bear the entire price, and we don't bear the entire burden, but that this depravity stops. This isn't just a nation state that brought order. Trains ran on time in Italy, under Mussolini. There was lots of law and order in Germany in the 1930s. The fact that ISIL can control an area and provide order is not a justification for allowing that sort of a regime to exist in the 21st century.
Yeah, Luke, I think it's an entirely legitimate question to ask. It's an important question to ask. And it's a particularly relevant question to ask in the recent aftermath of another war. And if you look back through the last century of American politics, what you see is every time the U.S. concludes some type of significant military involvement, understandably, the American people say, all right, well, now we have to take care of our own. We have to prioritize our own interests. It happened after World War I. It happened after the Second World War. After Korea, after Vietnam, after Iraq, understandably, an American people watching its young men and women dying in war didn't want to see that anymore. And every single time that vacuum developed, someone else, an individual or cause, a movement emerged to fill that vacuum and to create the kind of intolerable situation somewhere in the world that the other panelists were just talking about. And the phrase used was low-scale combat. And the way I interpret that, tell me if I'm mistaken, is, well, we should fight against ISIS to keep them from doing too many bad things, but not hard enough to keep them from doing any bad things. And I've never been in war, I've never been in the military, but I worry that kind of precise calibration is a fairly difficult one. And to tell young men and women of any nationality, we want you to fight, but in a low-scale way, to limit the atrocities, but not to eliminate them, is a pretty difficult thing to arrange. I want to read you a poem. It's on the wall at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and some of you may have heard this. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And I guess what I'd suggest is, if first they come for the Coptic Christians, and then they come for the Turkmen, and then they come for women and children and racial and ethnic minorities. And the lesson that they learn is, if we just behead a couple of U.S. journalists, the U.S. will go home. I wonder if that doesn't set precisely the wrong type of example for people in other parts of the world with just as evil, if not worse, motivations. So I'm so glad you asked the question because it's a critically important one. No one likes war, and it's especially difficult right after such a long and difficult one has ended or almost ended. But I worry that without someone, whether it's the United States or other Western democracies, whether it's the Saudi Arabia and Iran and the other Gulf states starting to step up, if someone doesn't fill that vacuum, someone else will.
That's
My name is Nina. I'm from Egypt. I'm actually a Coptic Christian. So this topic is very interesting for me. What I wanted to take your opinion on is the U.S. stance towards this issue. For example, lately we've been fighting with Shia militants from Iran, who a couple of years ago were the U.S.'s biggest fear. Syrian rebels, as we were talking now, as they were they were more moderate than the other ones. But what we actually fear in the Middle East is the Syrian rebels, for example, they've actually shown a lot of use of violence. For example, they've been eating organs of the captives of the Syrian army. What I think is very interesting is that the U.S. might now be seeing it as a short-term positive thing to do, is to get rid of ISIS. But what I personally see is that the U.S. is actually raising another power in the future, which was what happened with a lot of things before, like Al-Qaeda, how it actually started was the U.S. was training them in the Soviet war or whatever, and it ended up, because these people don't actually use rationale to, I think it's actually a very big threat to the U.S. in the future. What would you guys think about it?
Do you want to address it to any of the particular
It's a general
panelists?
question. I'd love to hear the different opinions.
So the question, as I understand it, is by hoping to solve this problem, does it not create bigger problems in the future?
Yeah.
I guess the way I look at it, and I think the other panelists deserve to weigh in as well, is the lesson to learn when you do the right thing badly is not to stop doing the right thing, it's to do the right thing better. And I think the lessons of the past that you alluded to suggest that even the most successful military campaign in the world, all by itself, not only can't solve a problem, but it almost certainly creates further and more difficult problems down the road. So while I think the term nation building has become pejorative, I think there should be an understanding that when the U.S. and its allies, both Western and Middle Eastern, engage militarily, it has to be the part of a multi-pronged effort that helps to build society, so that somebody who is victimized by the military action understands that the overall goals of the effort is not simply to destroy, but to replace with something better. Now that said, will destroying ISIS create a thriving democracy in Syria and Iraq? No, at least not unto itself. But when the kind of threat that the other panelists described exists, I would argue that democracy becomes a longer-term goal, and the more immediate one becomes simply eliminating that most immediate threat. But you can't lose sight of that long-term goal and not trying to create a society for people, but helping them create a society that is peaceful, that does respect those who have different faiths and different backgrounds. I think that's an obligation that comes along with military engagement, and doing either or the other, either without the other, is doomed to failure. You have to do both. I was talking a moment ago about isolationism after war. When Harry Truman left office in 1953, he was vilified. He was considered to be the least popular president of the modern era. And Harry Truman, at the end of World War II, insisted, and he ordered the U.S. government to institute a Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe after World War II. There was no domestic political constituency for the Marshall Plan whatsoever. But in the aftermath of military engagement, not trying to rebuild a society for Europe, for the Europeans, but providing them the tools and support and encouragement so they could recreate society for themselves, was a courageous and a brilliant course to take. And deservedly over time, Truman has become recognized as one of our greatest presidents because he was willing to stand up against his isolationist tendencies and help people who had suffered in war rebuild after it.
I'd like to build off Dan's point, particularly in regards to learning from past mistakes and building off of it. American and Saudi funding of the Mujahideen in the 1980s was obviously bit us back and caused a lot of these problems that we're facing now. But what we can learn from it is that you have to look at who you're funding and where the money's going, because we weren't directly funneling the money in there. We were funneling it through the Pakistanis. Pakistan had a certain agenda they wanted to play in Afghanistan. So what we need to do is we need to address the issue in a way where we're in control of where our money's going, where the training is going, who we're training. For example, in Iraq, working with the Peshmerga forces in Kurdistan, that's probably one of the smarter areas to put our resources in, help them out, help them actually enact the military strategy and take on ISIS than being the only ones involved in there. By doing that, that helps the Kurdish forces and Iraqi forces build a stronger military. That helps them retain more legitimacy amongst their people because they actually contributed to getting rid of ISIS rather than just the Americans. And that also involves more effort on the part of distinguishing who is a true Free Syrian Army, which is one of the reasons why Obama in 2012 didn't actually fund them. Part of the reason was it was a little difficult to distinguish who was the Free Syrian Army because it was just kind of a mishmash of a bunch of groups. Some were actually moderate by our standards. Some were moderate in relation to Assad and ISIS. One of those groups was, in fact, ISIS at that time, who was one of the counterpoints to al-Nusra. And we were against al-Nusra because that was Al-Qaeda's branch there. So it's kind of finding the right sort of area or the right groups to address and give her backing to.
Do we have any other questions this afternoon? One more, and then we need to wrap up.
David Word, Global Science Major, Junior. This is for Mr. O'Brien. With two evils, with Assad and ISIS, would you think that the administration should try to form some kind of relationship or engage in some kind of relationship with Assad to try to eliminate ISIS? Or do you think they should continue what they're doing?
I think they should both lose. and that's the, we need to figure out a way to make that happen. Let's keep in mind that the ISIL people are barbaric. Assad killed thousands of his own people with chemical weapons. Another form of barbarism. So, these are not nice people on either side, and we need to be very careful that we don't get drawn in to supporting Assad, which is what Assad has hoped that his strategy would do, by Assad ignoring ISIL and allowing ISIL to attack his opponents that were more moderate. He's hoped to draw the U.S. in on his side to then finish off ISIL, and he's the last man standing. We need to maintain our vigilance against Assad. We need to maintain our vigilance, even though we have a temporary, common interest. We need to maintain our vigilance against Iran and the mullahs who run a dictatorial regime there, and to put down the Green Revolution at the beginning of President Obama's term. With of course, we did not support the Democracy activists there. So we need to be very careful as we deal with ISIS that we don't make long-term deals with the devil, with a nuclear extremist Iran, with a Ba'athist, brutal government of Assad. And we need to support our allies, certainly the Kurds, as Shikhar pointed out, the Jordanians, the Israelis, the moderates in Lebanon. We need to do everything we can to support our allies to eliminate this threat and not, give a backhanded assist to some other folks that are pretty bad actors as well. And that's going to be hard to do. It's going to be hard for, it's not easy. It wouldn't be easy for a Republican president. It's not easy for the Obama administration. These are very, very difficult questions. And, so there are we may differ politically on some issues, but certainly our thoughts and prayers as Americans are with the president and those advising him, and most importantly with the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guard men that are called upon by us to defend this country and to implement the actions that are taking place now over in the Middle East. So they're the ones who need to be on thoughts. It's a tough, very, very difficult situations, and we're asking kids, for the most part, who are your age or younger, to go solve the problems for us. And so keep them in your thoughts and prayers as you watch the news over the next couple of weeks and months and years, maybe.
Well, thank you all for joining us with this to discuss this very serious and important topic today. I'd like to thank, first off, my co-moderator this afternoon, Yasmeen, Serhan, and our colleagues at the USA Daily Trojan. I'd like to thank our two students on the panel, Shikhar, Gupta, and Raymond, Nahn. And finally, my colleague at the Unruh Institute of Politics, Dan Schnur, and of course, Mr. Robert O'Brien. Thank you very much for being here. As always, our conversations continue next week. Next Wednesday, October 1st, we'll hold our next California Politics Roundtable discussion. That's in the evening at 7:30 with free food served at 7:15 over in Mudd Hall of Philosophy, room 102. And then 2 weeks from today, we'll be back here for our lunchtime series, Students Talk Back, where we will be discussing immigration policy, a little bit later than this afternoon. Right here in the forum, food served at 11:30 and discussion at 12. So thank you all once again for being here.